The priest who heard murder confessions and why he left every Friday night. The priest who heard murder confessions and why he left every Friday night. The confession booth was meant to be a sanctuary, a place where the worst sins could be whispered into the dark and mercy would wash over them like holy water. But at St. Augustine's Cathedral, the whispers had stopped sounding like sins and started sounding like instructions. Father Michael Rourke had served in the heart of New York for 27 years. By day, he blessed children, presided over weddings, and preached about forgiveness. But every Friday night, after the last confession, he would disappear into the city. No cassock, no collar, just a dark coat, a black cap, and eyes that looked like they'd already buried the souls of 100 men. The police never connected the murders. Different neighborhoods, different methods, different victims. But if you looked closely at the dates, you'd notice a pattern. Every crime happened on a Friday night, hours after Father Rourke left the cathedral. And the most disturbing part, many of the victims had attended confession earlier that day. Those who dared to ask where the priest went were met with the same calm smile. God works in mysterious ways, he would say. But behind those words, there was something else, an unspoken certainty, as if he already knew which names would appear in tomorrow's headlines. Now, decades later, an unmarked box has been found in the cathedral's basement, containing tapes of confessions never meant to be heard again. On them, the voices are trembling, desperate, and in more than one, you can hear Father Rourke speaking back, not offering forgiveness, not offering prayer, just giving quiet, precise directions, and ending with the same chilling phrase, "I'll see you Friday night." The city never questioned Father Michael Rourke's devotion. He had been the face of St. Augustine's Cathedral for decades, a steady, calming presence in a neighborhood that had long since forgotten what safety felt like. But within the heavy stone walls of that church, there were things no sermon could cleanse. In the confessional, sins were supposed to die. Instead, they took root. Rourke listened, not with the ears of a man of God, but with the precision of someone mapping every detail, names, addresses, routines. His eyes stayed closed, but his mind was wide open, filing every word away. And when the booth went silent, he would rise, change his clothes, and vanish into the night, always on a Friday, always alone. For years, the murders went unnoticed by the public. They were written off as random acts in a city drowning in crime. But patterns have a way of bleeding through, and whispers began to circulate, not in the streets but in the pews. Parishioners spoke of seeing the priest in places no priest should be, of hearing his voice where no prayers were said. Tonight, you're going to step into those shadows. You'll follow the trail left in the margins of police reports and hidden in the static of old cassette tapes. You'll hear the voices that were never meant to be heard outside the booth. And you'll decide whether Father Rourke was a shepherd protecting his flock or a hunter choosing his prey. Before we begin, leave a comment with your country and city. Let us know where you're watching from. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because once you've heard this story, you'll understand why some confessions should never be repeated. Chapter 1. The Last Confession. It was raining hard that night. The kind of rain that drowns the city's noise in a dull, endless hiss. The stained glass windows of St. Augustine's glowed faintly against the black streets, casting fractured colors on the puddles outside. Inside, the church was nearly empty. The few candles burning along the altar flickered whenever the heavy wooden doors opened, and the scent of wet stone mixed with incense hung in the air like a weight. Father Michael Rourke sat in the confessional, listening. The voice on the other side was shaking, but it wasn't the trembling of guilt. It was fear, a man's tone, low and deliberate, listing details with the precision of someone reading from a ledger. The time the lights went out in a certain building, the sound of footsteps on a fire escape, the way the door latch stuck for just a moment before breaking. The priest didn't interrupt, didn't absolve. He simply absorbed. "You know what you must do," Rourke said finally, his words steady as a heartbeat. The man's breathing quickened. "And when it's done, leave the gloves in the confessional. I'll take care of the rest." There was no prayer, no penance, just the scrape of the booth's door and the slow fade of footsteps into the nave. Minutes later, Rourke extinguished the candles one by one, moving with the kind of precision that only comes from repetition. He removed his cassock, hung it neatly, and opened the small wardrobe behind the pulpit. Inside, a black wool coat, worn leather gloves, and a cap that shadowed his eyes. His reflection in the mirror looked less like a man of God and more like a man who knew exactly where he was going. At exactly 11:15 p.m., he stepped out into the rain. He moved quickly but without urgency, weaving through side streets that only locals would know. Every turn felt calculated, avoiding main roads, passing through alleys where even the streetlights had given up. He didn't glance back once. 3 blocks away, a dark sedan idled by the curb. He opened the passenger door without knocking, without greeting. Inside sat a man with a face lost in shadow. They exchanged no words, but an envelope passed from driver to passenger, thick enough to suggest it contained more than paper. Rourke tucked it into his coat and the car pulled away without a sound. By the time he reached the edge of the river, the rain had slowed to a mist. The industrial warehouses loomed like sleeping giants, their windows black, their doors chained. Rourke stopped beneath a rusted awning and waited. 2 minutes later, a figure emerged from the darkness. Tall, thin, hood pulled low. The only sound was the slosh of water in the gutters as they stood face to face. From inside his coat, Rourke produced something small, wrapped in cloth. The figure took it, glanced inside, and nodded once. No handshake, no farewell. They disappeared into separate directions, swallowed by the shadows of the docks. Hours later, police would cordon off a crime scene on the far side of the city. A man was found in his apartment, lifeless, with no signs of forced entry and no fingerprints on anything. The neighbors told detectives they'd seen a priest in the building earlier that evening, but none of them could agree on the details. Some said he was young, others swore he was older, and one insisted he had no face at all. Back at St. Augustine's, just before dawn, Father Rourke returned to the booth. He placed a pair of damp leather gloves inside, then closed the door and locked it. Alone in the empty church, he whispered something in Latin. Not a prayer, but a promise. Outside, the city was waking up. Inside, the confessional was still warm. And somewhere far from the cathedral, another Friday night had ended in silence. Chapter 2. Patterns in the Shadows. Detective Laura Bennett had been in the NYPD's Homicide Division for over a decade, and she'd learned one thing: patterns don't scream, they whisper. You had to lean in close, study the shadows between the obvious facts to hear them. It was 3 in the morning when she first noticed the whisper in the Friday night murders. On her desk sat 3 open case files from different boroughs: a high-profile defense attorney in Queens, a retired dock worker in Brooklyn, and a young man with gang ties in the Bronx. No connections on paper, no shared acquaintances, no financial links, no DNA. But the crime scene photos told a different story. Each victim's wristwatch had stopped at 11:47 p.m. And in every case, there were faint traces of candle wax near the body. Laura traced the locations on a map, a red pin for each crime. Slowly, a crescent-shaped path formed, curving toward the center of Manhattan and ending within a few blocks of St. Augustine's Cathedral. It was a detail too neat to be coincidence, but too fragile to stand up in court. She decided to dig into the cathedral's records. The public archives painted Father Michael Rourke as a saint. Community programs, charity events, spotless reputation. But beneath the surface, in police incident logs, she found reports from parishioners who claimed the priest was restless on Friday nights, often leaving before midnight and returning at dawn. None of those reports had ever been pursued. Laura's partner, Detective Harris, was skeptical. "You think a priest's moonlighting as a hitman," he scoffed, leaning back in his chair. But when Laura showed him a grainy CCTV still from a warehouse district camera, a tall man in a black coat meeting another figure in the rain, Harris stopped laughing. The timestamp? Friday, 11:48 p.m. The next step was surveillance. They couldn't get a warrant without cause, but they could watch. That Friday, Laura parked 2 blocks from the cathedral, eyes locked on the side door. At exactly 11:15 p.m., Father Rourke emerged, dressed exactly as the witness descriptions had suggested. He moved with that same purposeful stride, disappearing into the labyrinth of backstreets. They tailed him as far as the river, but lost him when a freight truck blocked the narrow road. By the time they cleared it, Rourke was gone. No sign of him on foot or by car. Harris swore under his breath. Laura didn't answer. She was staring at a faint glow in the distance, flickering between the gaps of the warehouses. Candlelight. Back at the precinct, she dug deeper. Records from the diocese showed that Rourke had been transferred abruptly from a rural parish upstate nearly 30 years ago. No reason given. But in that parish's archives, there were whispers of unorthodox confessional practices and unsanctioned penance assignments. Every incident occurred on a Friday. Laura printed the old reports and pinned them beside her current cases. The dates lined up in a way that made her skin crawl, as if the murders had been migrating across the state, week by week, until they finally settled here. She stared at the wall of evidence, feeling the shape of something larger, older, and far more deliberate than a lone killer. That night, as she left the precinct, she passed by St. Augustine's. The cathedral loomed in the dark, its spire cutting into the low clouds. For just a moment, she thought she saw movement in the upper windows, a shadow pacing slowly, pausing at each step. Then the light vanished, and the street was left in silence. Laura knew one thing for certain. If she wanted answers, she'd have to go inside the booth where it all began. Chapter 3. The booth. The cathedral was nearly empty when Detective Laura Bennett stepped inside. Rain streaked the stained glass windows, blurring the saints into distorted shapes. Her footsteps echoed along the nave, and the air was thick with the scent of incense and something else. Old wood soaked in centuries of whispers. She moved toward the confessional, its carved wooden door half hidden in shadow. In daylight, it might have looked ornate, even beautiful, but now it seemed like a mouth, half open, waiting. She hesitated before opening it, her hand resting on the polished handle worn smooth by countless penitents. Inside, the darkness was almost complete. The seat creaked under her weight, and the screen to the other side was nothing but a black lattice. She closed her eyes, letting her hearing take over. At first, there was only silence, then the faintest sound, a slow, deliberate breathing that wasn't hers. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," a voice said from the other side, low, male, shaking, but not with guilt, with urgency. Laura's heart thudded. She hadn't announced herself. Whoever was speaking thought they were talking to Father Rourke. The man began describing a scene in precise detail, an apartment on the east side, the hallway light that flickered before going out, the neighbor who left every night at 10:30. Laura's pen was in her hand before she realized she'd taken it out. Then came the pause, a shift in the air, and a new voice, calm, measured, and unmistakable. "You'll do it tonight," Father Rourke said. "And when you're done, bring me the watch." Laura's breath caught. The other man whispered something she couldn't catch, and then nothing, just the sound of footsteps leaving. And in that moment, Laura understood. The confessional wasn't a place of forgiveness here. It was a place of orders. Chapter 4. The Plan. Laura sat in her car across from St. Augustine's, rain blurring the windshield into streaks of neon and shadow. Her hands were tight on the steering wheel, her mind replaying every word she'd heard in that booth. It wasn't enough for a conviction, not yet, but it was enough to know she was dealing with something far more calculated than a rogue priest with blood on his hands. She thought of the victims, different ages, different lives, but all somehow funneled through that same wooden door before meeting their end. The confessional wasn't just where Father Rourke listened, it was where he selected, and the Friday night disappearances, they were the execution of those selections. The next morning, she met Detective Harris at a diner 3 blocks from the precinct. The smell of burnt coffee and frying eggs hung between them as she laid it all out. The voices, the orders, the timeline. Harris leaned back, skeptical but uneasy. "So what? We plant a wire in the booth? You know how fast the Archdiocese will shut us down for that?" Laura shook her head. "We don't need to bug it. We bait it." She slid a file across the table, a controlled informant, clean record, willing to pose as a confessor. The plan was simple. Feed Rourke a fake sin, a scenario designed to provoke instructions. If he gave them, it would be caught on camera. Harris tapped the folder, still unconvinced. "And if he smells the setup?" Laura's jaw tightened. "Then we follow him. We don't stop until we know where he goes and who's on the other side of those deals." By Friday, the plan was in motion. The informant would enter the booth at 10:30 p.m., and Laura would be waiting outside with an unmarked team. But as she watched the hours tick away, an unease began to creep in, the kind that told her Rourke might already know she'd been inside his booth. That night, when the cathedral's bells rang 11, the street outside was silent, too silent. Chapter 5. The Trap Turns. The cathedral doors opened with a groan, spilling warm candlelight into the cold night. Laura, hidden in the shadows of a recessed doorway across the street, lifted her radio to her lips. "Eyes on the target," she whispered. At 10:28 p.m., the informant stepped inside. He moved exactly as they'd rehearsed, hesitant, head down, every inch the image of a man seeking absolution. Laura could almost feel her pulse sinking with his steps as he disappeared into the confessional. Minutes passed, too many minutes. The team in the unmarked van down the block reported no movement. Harris was crouched beside her, scanning the street. "What's taking so long?" he muttered. Then the booth's door opened, but it wasn't the informant who stepped out. It was Rourke, and he wasn't wearing his cassock. He was in the black coat, gloves already on, eyes scanning the street like he'd been expecting someone to watch. Laura's stomach dropped. She pressed her radio. "Team, he's moving. Maintain distance. Do not engage." Rourke didn't head for the side streets like before. Instead, he walked directly toward the darker part of the block, the one where the streetlights had been dead for weeks. Harris frowned. "He's changing his route." In the van, one of the surveillance officers cursed. "We've lost visual on the informant. Booth's empty." Laura froze. "What do you mean, empty?" But before she could move, a van with blacked-out windows rolled slowly past the cathedral and disappeared around the corner, the same direction Rourke had gone. It was too neat, too timed. She realized then that the plan hadn't just failed, it had been inverted. Somewhere in those last few minutes, the hunter had become the prey, and Rourke was leading them exactly where he wanted them. Chapter 6. Off the record. Laura didn't wait for approval. The moment the van vanished around the corner, she stepped out from the shadows and started moving, her pace quickening until the wet pavement began splashing under her boots. Harris called after her, voice low but sharp. "Bennett, we don't have backup in position." She didn't care. Every second they waited was another second Rourke had to disappear, or worse. The alley swallowed her in damp darkness, the air thick with the smell of old rain, rust, and something faintly metallic. She kept her footsteps light, hugging the brick walls, listening for the echo of movement ahead. Somewhere beyond the maze of back streets, she heard the faint hum of an engine idling. It wasn't moving, it was waiting. Her radio crackled. "Bennett, stand down, we've got units circling." But she clicked it off without answering. Protocol had its place, but not when the target was a man who had already outplayed them twice. Rounding a corner, she caught sight of the van again, parked beneath a busted street lamp that flickered like a dying heartbeat. The side door was half open, and shadows moved inside. 2 figures. One was definitely Rourke. The other, she couldn't tell. She edged closer, keeping to the line of dumpsters, her breath controlled, her hand resting on the grip of her service weapon. The voices were low, almost drowned out by the drip of water from a rusted fire escape, but she could make out enough. Tonight, no trail, bring it to the river. Then, something unexpected. Rourke turned, and for the briefest second, Laura saw his face illuminated by the weak light. He wasn't startled. He wasn't even tense. He was smiling. The side door of the van slid shut with a heavy thud. The engine roared to life. Laura moved in, ready to force them to stop, but then her eyes caught something on the ground, a leather glove, damp from the rain, lying exactly in her path, not dropped, placed. She crouched, picking it up slowly. Inside, pressed into the lining, was a folded piece of paper. Her fingers unwrapped it, the ink bleeding slightly from the damp. 6 words, scrawled in precise handwriting. "See you in the booth, detective." Her pulse slammed in her ears. The van was already gone, its taillights swallowed by the fog rolling off the river. She stood there alone, glove in one hand, note in the other, realizing the truth she didn't want to face. Rourke wasn't running, he was inviting her in. Chapter 7. The return to the booth. The next day, the cathedral loomed over the city like a sentinel. Its spire pierced the heavy grey sky, bells tolling in slow, mournful waves that seemed to echo inside Laura's skull. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the 6 words on that rain-soaked note. "See you in the booth, detective." It wasn't just a taunt. It was a contract. He was telling her where to find him, and when. And if she didn't come, he'd take it as weakness. Laura entered through the side door, bypassing the main nave, where a handful of parishioners murmured their midday prayers. The confessional sat in the shadows like a waiting predator, carved wood catching what little light slipped through the stained glass. Her instincts screamed that this was a trap, but there was no other way forward. She stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a dull click. The air was close, heavy with incense and something else. Faint traces of candle wax and old leather. She lowered herself onto the seat, feeling the grain of the wood beneath her fingers. Silence stretched. Then the familiar slide of the screen. Rourke's voice came through, low and steady. "Bless me, detective, for I have sinned." Her grip tightened. "This isn't a confession," she said. "This is an interrogation." He chuckled softly, the sound more unsettling than any threat. "Interrogation implies you have the upper hand. What happened to the informant?" She pressed. "Alive," he said after a pause. "For now. But you didn't come here for him. You came because you want to understand why." His words were slow, deliberate, like each one was being weighed before release. "Every Friday they come to me. Killers, liars, thieves. They spill their sins, and I decide which ones the law will never touch. I take care of them, personally." Laura leaned forward. "You're not cleansing souls. You're picking targets." "That's where you're wrong," Rourke replied. "I'm freeing them." Before she could respond, the door to the confessional slammed shut from the outside. She was locked in, and his breathing was no longer coming from behind the screen. It was right behind her. Chapter 8. The Passage. The air shifted behind her, and Laura spun, her hand on her weapon. But there was no one, just the darkness of the confessional. The space was too small for someone to hide, yet the breathing she'd heard was still in her ears. Then came a faint sound, a click, followed by the groan of wood on wood. The panel behind her seat moved an inch, revealing a thin line of light. Laura pushed, and the panel slid open completely, exposing a narrow passage descending into darkness. She drew her flashlight and stepped inside. The air was damp, carrying the heavy scent of mildew and something far more sinister. Old blood, faint but unmistakable. The wooden floor beneath her creaked with every step, and the walls closed in, lined with crude carvings that looked more like scratches than scripture. The passage sloped downward, leading her to a small stone chamber lit by a single candle. In the center stood a wooden chair with leather straps on the arms and legs, dark stains soaking into the grain. Around it were shelves stacked with small objects, watches, rings, wallets, all meticulously labeled with dates. Her stomach turned when she recognized some of the names from her case files. A sound behind her made her spin. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the shadows at the far end of the chamber. Rourke stepped into the light, his face calm, almost serene. "You've seen my confessional," he said softly. "Now you see my penance." Laura leveled her weapon. "This ends tonight." Rourke smiled faintly. "No, detective. Tonight, it begins." From the darkness behind him, other figures emerged, men and women, their faces blank, their eyes fixed on her, parishioners or disciples. And in that moment, she realized the truth. Rourke wasn't working alone. Chapter 9, The Descent. Laura's finger tightened on the trigger, but she knew the math. One gun, a single clip, and at least 6 bodies closing in. The candlelight flickered across their faces, revealing something far worse than fear or rage. Devotion. The chamber seemed to breathe with them, the walls pressing in as they advanced. Rourke didn't move. He stood in the center, hands clasped as if presiding over a sermon. "You've walked into the heart of it," he said, his voice echoing off the damp stone. "And now, you'll understand why none of them ever leave." Laura's eyes darted around the room. The only way out was the passage she'd come from, now blocked by 2 of the disciples, or the dark archway behind Rourke, where the stone steps spiraled down even further underground. He gestured toward the chair in the center of the room. "Sit, detective. Let me hear your confession." Her reply was a sharp step backward toward the archway. "Not tonight, Father." Then she moved. 2 quick shots rang out, shattering the candle's glass holder and plunging the chamber into near darkness. Shouts erupted, footsteps scattering, but she used the chaos to dart past Rourke and into the stairwell. The descent was steep and slick, each step echoing into what felt like an endless pit. The air grew colder, the smell sharper, salt, mold, and the unmistakable rot of things long dead. She heard them following, the measured steps of Rourke's shoes distinct from the uneven scramble of the others. At the bottom, her flashlight beam caught on something metallic. A heavy iron door bolted from the outside. She yanked it open, the hinges screaming in protest, and found herself staring at a long, low tunnel, water pooling ankle deep. Somewhere ahead, the faint sound of running water mixed with something else, a low, rhythmic knocking. Then, a voice carried through the tunnel, calm and close. "You're almost at the river, detective, but the river only carries the dead." Chapter 10, Where the Tide Ends. The tunnel narrowed, forcing Laura to lower her head as she moved through the ankle-deep water. The sound of the river grew louder, a constant roar that seemed to vibrate through the stone. Her flashlight flickered, the beam catching on slick walls and the glint of rusted chains hanging from hooks. She could see the faint shimmer of moonlight ahead, the exit, but just as she reached it, a shadow detached itself from the darkness and blocked her path. Rourke stood there, calm as ever, the river raging behind him. "You've made it this far," he said, his voice almost drowned by the water, "but you still don't understand. I'm not the monster. I'm the cure." Laura leveled her weapon. "The cure doesn't leave bodies in the ground." He took a slow step forward, the water swirling around his boots. "The system is broken, detective. You know it. Men walk free who should rot. Women vanish, and no one even files the report. I correct that." She kept her aim steady, her finger tight on the trigger. "And the people in that chamber, the ones who follow you," Rourke's lips curved into a faint smile, "they were lost. I gave them purpose." For a long moment, neither moved. Then, from the shadows behind her, she heard the splash of footsteps, his disciples closing in. Rourke tilted his head toward the river. "You have a choice. End me here, or walk away and save yourself." Laura's breath came slow and steady. She made her decision. A single shot cracked through the tunnel, echoing off the stone. Rourke's body crumpled into the black water, swept instantly toward the open current. The disciples froze, their devotion shattered in that instant. Laura stepped into the moonlight, the cold river spray hitting her face. She didn't look back, because somewhere deep down, she knew this wasn't the end, just the first tide. The official report would call it a justified shooting. The department would sign off, the archdiocese would issue a carefully worded statement, and the city would move on, eager to bury the memory of a priest who hunted in the name of salvation. But Laura knew the truth, the kind you couldn't put on paper. The river hadn't given Rourke back. No divers had found his body. No fishermen had tangled their nets on him. The current had claimed him, and perhaps that was enough for everyone else. But at night, Laura would wake to the sound of water rushing in her ears, and sometimes in the quiet between breaths, she swore she could still hear his voice, calm, patient, waiting. Weeks later, she walked past St. Augustine's on a rainy Friday night. The cathedral doors were open, the candles glowing softly inside, and for a moment, just a moment, she thought she saw a figure in the booth, not praying, not waiting for absolution, waiting for her. She didn't go in. She kept walking, telling herself it was only her imagination.